We have reached the end of the line, folks. Pat yourself on the back, clap your hands. We are in chapter 12. This is our final chapter to close out our block on corrections. And it's also the final chapter which concludes the three primary components of the criminal justice system. It's amazing how we've been in for several weeks, right? And we, even though it's been a lot of work, a lot of chapters per week, but we are at the end of the line. So this chapter, chapter 12, focuses on prison life and life after prison. Now, if for some reason you're looking at this chapter and you haven't seen chapters 10 or 11, stop this recording, go back, look at the beginning of the block, okay? Chapter 10 focuses on community corrections. It's a form of corrections, but the inmate or the individual lives in the community. Then, and in that chapter, we talked about probation. Then, the last lecture that I recorded, chapter 11, focuses on institutional corrections. In other words, what are the differences between jails and prisons? What are some of the risks and security levels of prisons? What are some of the early forms of punishment? How did we originate from hanging and flogging and branding to where we are today with punishment? And of course, we ended that lecture looking at why the United States, as the freest and the greatest and the best democracy in the world, incarcerates more people than any other developed democracy, period, by almost 4-1. Here we're going to end this block or this module looking at prison life and life after prison. So prisons, just to recap, prisons are long-term correctional institutions to house people who have committed and been sentenced for serious crimes. Now, I want you to remember, you cannot go to prison with just misdemeanor offenses. Please remember that, okay? We talked about it in the last lecture. You need felonies, and it's highlighted there. Felonies are what will get someone sent to prison. Now, prison is typically and commonly referred to as DOC, Department of Corrections. Some states are different. For example, Georgia will call themselves GDC, Georgia Department Corrections, GDC. It's still the DOC, but they just abbreviated Georgia GDC. Florida will say DOC, Department of Corrections. Alabama will say Department of Corrections, and other states will have Department of Corrections. But generally speaking, if you hear the term DOC, it's referring to as Department of Corrections, not the rapper. And I know that's a little corny pun you won't understand, but there was a rapper back in the day with NWA. His name was DOC. Okay, not DOC. We're talking about Department of Corrections. So when living in prison, understand that the state is responsible for the safety and well-being of those it incarcerates, as well as the safety and well-being of the public. Now, remember way back in the courts module a week ago, typically the prosecutor, the district attorney, the state attorney, whatever you want to call them, they are responsible for representing the people. They don't represent the victim, they represent the people. The victim has a victim advocate, or they have someone that will speak on their behalf, but the prosecutor is there to represent the people. In this instance, anyone who is incarcerated, the state is responsible for ensuring that people who are incarcerated are safe, but also they're responsible for keeping those people who are incarcerated safe from the community and keeping the community safe too. So the common mission of many correctional institutions are to keep inmates and offenders and people who have been sentenced for whatever crimes safe, while also keeping the community safe. In an effort to keep them safe, those individuals will be incarcerated. Now, there's some challenges to the prison environment. For example, think about the loss of freedom and the loss of everyday routines we take for granted, right? Think about how offenders enter prison, they have to change their behaviors. I used to do this all the time, class, especially back in my law enforcement days, with dealing with young people and offenders, taking them to jail, etc. I used to say, imagine you being in this place. You have to get up when the staff tell you to wake up. You have to eat when the staff tell you to eat. You can't just go grab a snack from the fridge. You can't just kick your feet up and lounge around and watch whatever you want to see on Netflix or Hulu or Prime. You can't just use your cell phone, although cell phones are in jails and prisons, but that's for a corrections class. But you can't just use your cell phone and scroll on TikTok or Instagram or other social media sites. You lose freedoms that we take for granted every day. Going to prison is not a place for most people. And then later in the lecture, as I end, I'm going to show you some pictures of people who clearly have been to prison. And the very last person I'm going to show you, I actually dealt with a long time ago. And very rough. I would be honest, when I show you his picture, I'd be like, he would probably hurt most of my students, period. So when someone is incarcerated, especially when they go to prison, it is very expensive. And this is why, class, and again, I don't know if I'm ever going to get the luxury of lecturing on corrections. I will tell you, and this could be a little bonus question, I've worked in 2 out of the 3 primary components of the criminal justice system. I've worked in law enforcement. You saw my time, and you've heard my time at the sheriff's office. I've worked in the courts. When I was a probation officer, I also did something called court reporting. It was digital court reporting at the time. It wasn't real-time reporting, RPR. That's where you have the stenographer in, and they're like typing really quick, and they're looking kind of funny when they're typing, but they have a stenographer machine that's capturing what they're saying. I did digital court reporting, which was similar. Sometimes we'd be in the courtroom, but other times we'd be in a separate room recording the proceeding. So I would do that, but I never did corrections, folks. I never worked in corrections. And I came close. I came close at least twice. One time when I was with the sheriff's office, they had a transfer program where they were like, they didn't care what unit or they didn't care what unit you were in, that they were offering an opportunity for a one-time transfer to go to the jail. And the sheriff's office was going to cover all the training and costs associated with that. And I remember a girl that I used to work with who was a probation officer when I was with the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. She was a victim advocate. She was like, I'm sick and tired of this. I'm going over there. She went to the jail, and she probably did it for like a year, maybe a year and a half. And then she eventually left. I think she moved to Maryland. So I was going to do it. I was like, you know what? I'm kind of tired of dealing with juveniles. I'll give my hand at being a detention officer or detention deputy. I was on the line going to apply to it. I don't like the shift. The shift was the one drawback. And you would work 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. or 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. But you really had to be there at 6 o'clock because you had to do shift briefing. So you had a long day. I ran into at the time, he wasn't my sergeant. He was a deputy. But he became my sergeant because he came back to the unit, the juvenile bureau. And I told him. And I was like, hey, Sarge, I called him by his first name because we were cool like that. I was like, I'm really thinking about doing this. What do you think? He said, I'm going to tell you something. He's like, I got a good friend of mine, a brother who's over there who is a sergeant. He said the place is a dump. He was like, you, with your intellect and what you bring and what you're doing for that bureau that you're in, don't waste your talent going over there. And because I regarded and had a strong affinity and appreciation for that sergeant, I did not apply. So that was one story, and I don't have to tell the other story. But either way, corrections is the one unit, or it's the one component of the criminal justice system I never worked in. Came very close another time, extremely close, like right at the edge, but didn't get over the finish line. So when housing inmates, typically it'll cost about $35,000 annually in a federal facility. Those numbers are less in state facilities, but either way, prison is very costly. It's costly to taxpayers, it's costly to correctional officers, inmates, and even administrators. It costs a lot. So you heard me use the term correctional officer. I want to draw your attention at the bottom of the lecture. They are not called guards. Do not call them a guard. I have heard people who in a professional setting say, oh yeah, the guards are going to come and get you, or the guards are going to take you. And I'm like doing one of these numbers because they're not guards. They're correctional officers. The correctional officer title is part of the professional aspect of the career. And again, I love lecturing on corrections. Again, I am putting that on my to-do list to lecture on in the future. I haven't done it in years, but it has been a blast because while I've never worked in the field, it is such a fascinating field. It is one that is not understood. Plus, generally speaking, I get to do the coolest field trips with those students. I just really, it irks me that people don't call them correctional officers. They call them guards, and that's not professional. You wouldn't call a police officer I'm just saying, a copper. You wouldn't call him a copper. You would call him an officer, or you'd call him a police officer. Some people say, oh, you're a cop. But either way, you wouldn't call him something like a copper or anything derogatory. You call them a law enforcement officer. And so with correctional officers, they take an oath to protect and serve, just like probation officers take an oath to protect and serve, and police officers take an oath to protect and serve. The problem we have here, class, is that sometimes they could be tempted to introduce contraband. And why is that? Well, oftentimes it's due to the low pay. Now, I'm going to read something, and I didn't share this with my screen, and so you'll have to just bear with me while I read this for a moment. But generally speaking, they used to get very low pay. Correctional officers would start off making, 22, 23, 25,000 a year at most. They wouldn't make much money, despite the fact that they are dealing with violent inmates or inmates who can be violent because they have a lengthy prison sentence. So you'll have to take my word for this because, again, I wish I was sharing this on my screen. But I pulled up, literally in the course of getting ready for this lecture, I said, well, let me look up a correctional officer position that's available near me here in Georgia or in the metro Atlanta area. So I found one. It is over in Beaufort, Georgia, and it is at Phillips State Prison. That's a major prison in and around Georgia. The correctional officer starts at $48,448.40 per year to $58,119.80 per year. Typically, with the state, you will start at the starting pay rate. The only way you would start a little bit higher is if you have prior experience. So if you're a person fresh out of college, right, you can, get a salary that's almost $50,000 a year. Not quite, but if the cost of living in and around this metro Atlanta area, or if you have family here, that may not be too bad of a start as you're getting your start. With that being said, you will have to undergo some serious training. They will certify you under Georgia Peace Officer Standards in Training Council or Post. You have to be 21. Again, they do like the fact that some people have college education. So if you had like a college degree, that'll get you help. But let me just read some of these questions off, and then we'll go back to the lecture. If you want to be a correctional officer, especially in the state of Georgia, you have to answer, 20 questions, yes. And if one of these questions is no, you're eliminated. Are you willing to work any shift, including nights, days, weekends, and holidays? Are you willing to work every weekend with your regular days off during the week? In other words, hey, you're always working Saturday and Sunday. You might get Monday and Tuesday off. You might get Wednesday and Thursday off. You might even get Thursday and Friday, but you will work every single weekend. Are you willing to work all holidays? Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, your birthday. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to follow a certain dress code with restrictions on your length of hair and facial hair? Me, right now, I'm already eliminated because it's the summer. I'm enjoying myself. I haven't shaved, but I can't have this. Nope. You better be clean shaven. Are you ready? Are you willing to work in a locked area with prisoners who are guilty of violent crimes, murder, rape, etc., or they might be mentally ill? Are you willing to give first aid, including CPR, to prisoners who are injured or seriously ill? They may have HIV. They may have AIDS. They may have hepatitis. You can't be like, oh, you got AIDS. Oh, no, I'm not going to help you. No, you got to help them. Are you willing to search, pat frisk people, regardless of their sex, for things that they are not allowed to have, and visually search or strip search them, including body cavities, of prisoners the same sex as you for prohibited items. Fellas, if you're a male fella in my class, you'll search another male. And the whole cough and bend over and squat is real. I've had many jail officials, because I've taken quite a few of my students to field trips at jails and prisons, and they say, oh, that's real. Ladies, you have other places you have to search. So I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but the point I'm making is you have to answer yes to all those questions. And if you cannot do it, then you can't be a correctional officer. So think about that if you were ever thinking of a career in corrections. So when you are dealing with officials and individuals, rather, who are incarcerated, that are in prison, you have to understand that there is some lingo, and you don't want to be caught slipping or not aware of what these things mean. If you hear inmates talking about, yeah, I need a bone, I need a bone, that doesn't mean they need a chicken bone or they're hungry. That means they need a shank. They're probably going to go ahead and try to knife somebody. You know, if you hear them talking about, hey, I'm giving a green light over there, that means that I'm ordering somebody that I'm affiliated with to kill somebody. So understand and recognize that this lingo, you have to keep up on it. And there are a lot of different terms. In fact, what has been often said is that when you're in prison, you almost learn a whole new language, because they will have different words for different meanings, that on the outside we hear a bone and we go, shoot, you know, what you bone, or like chicken bone or ham bone or whatever, or, you know, green light. Yeah, I don't want to sit at a red light. I want to drive through a green light. Like, that's the naivety. Oh, soda? Yeah, I drink an occasional soda, not all the time, but in prison it means cocaine. So if you say, hey, I need some soda, you're not talking about Coke or Pepsi or Sprite. You're talking about cocaine. You have to know what these terms mean if you are a correctional officer. Subcultures do exist in prison. And what we mean by a subculture is that there are three models used to explain inmate subculture. In other words, think of what's called the macrocosm. So I used to have an individual I know, and he actually is a barber. He cuts my son's hair, because my son has, you know, the new style of hair that kids have today. And I had him come to my class several times. And he's a very knowledgeable person. And I tell the students from day one, you will have a special guest that will come in here. And I don't care how versed I am, how well I know this book from the front to the back. Please understand that I cannot tell you what goes on in a prison, because I've never lived in a prison and I've never worked in a prison. He can. And this individual is from Ohio, and he was in there for attempted murder, along with felonious assault and some other serious charges. And he always called prison the microcosm. He said, when you're out in the real world, you're in the macrocosm, right? This is the real world. You have your structure, you know where to go, what to do, etc. That's the macrocosm. When you go to prison, you're operating under the microcosm. But in the microcosm, because you have to adjust to prison life, this is where subculture comes in. Think about the deprivation model. Prisons require inmates to adapt to being deprived of basic rights and needs. You are deprived. You can't go hug your loved one. You can't go just talk to your children or talk to your parents or talk to your boyfriend or girlfriend when you want. You're limited, right? The importation model states that experiences and socialization from the outside world is brought in to contribute to behavior. So basically, you're importing your values, how you are on the outside, into prison. If you are a tough, macho person, male or female, you're going to bring those skills into prison. You're going to need those skills. But if you're like very bashful and shy and mild-mannered and a little bit weak and kind of unassuming, you're going to have a hard time, because you're bringing that in. You can't just toughen up overnight. You're going to have to toughen up while you're in there. So you're importing some values from the outside into the prison. And then lastly, you have the situational model. This emphasizes place, time, and person to understand behavior. You're going to adapt. You might come in there and you're used to most situations working out where you don't have to get violent and you can avoid certain issues or problems. But sooner or later, something's going to happen and you got to adapt. What are you going to do when you're in the shower and somebody's trying to come after you? What are you going to do when you're sitting there eating that horrible prison food and somebody snatches food off your plate? If you don't fight back, everybody's going to start snatching food off your plate immediately. You have to, and you will be tried. What are you going to do in certain situations? So in terms of prison violence, just again, giving you a little bit, because this is an intro class, so we're not going to go ahead and get too deep in the weeds. But prison gangs, most of them originated in the 1950s. The gangs are typically drawn along racial lines. The largest prison gang, period, is the Aryan Brotherhood, as you see up top. That was the Birdman of Texas. He actually recently passed away, too, in prison. But other notable gangs include the Mexican Mafia, La M.A., La Nuestra Familia, BGF, Black Guerrilla Family, and the Texas Syndicate. Most people will join a prison gang for survival. And I talk about prison gangs in my gangs class, and I talk about it in corrections. Now, violence can take many forms. Inmate on inmate is the most common form of violence. You're living with people that you wouldn't probably live with. You're not in prison typically with your brother. You're not in prison with a cousin or a family member. You might be, but for classification purposes, sometimes they might keep you separated because they don't want you ganging up on people, right? With that being said, inmate on inmate is obviously the most common because this is where you're just going to have a disagreement. You don't like how somebody's looking at you. Somebody made a pass at you. Somebody tried you, and you're going to go ahead and attack, right? And that's inmate on inmate. You got inmate on officer. There's videos that you'll see out there and videos that I will attach where an inmate will attack an officer. An officer might not even know it's coming. That's why you always have to keep your head on a swivel. You want to be safe and you want to be ready because at a moment's notice, an inmate can automatically just attack an officer. And then you have an officer on inmate where, again, other videos that I'll include, officers may go ahead and start attacking inmates for whatever reason. Beating and pummeling inmates because the inmate looked at them the wrong way, said something, wasn't listening. So because officers have pent up anger and rage, they take it out on the inmate. So violence can be any one of those three. Inmate on officer, officer on inmate. Now, violence can also occur for a number of reasons. Fear, inmates are scared, or they're fearful, or maybe they just attack another inmate to set the tone because they are afraid. Maybe they want to get thrown into solitary confinement. That's why they hit an officer, and that's going to get them 30 days in solitary confinement, so they're away from danger. Anger, just being incarcerated in prison will make you angry. Think about you lost your freedom, and now you can't come and go as you please. Oh, you're going to be very angry. And then for some, acting out. They just do it because that's their nature. They act out. They don't have any self-control. And so for them, acting out is, I'm just going to be violent just because I can. But the weapons that you see on the left are called shanks. And let me tell you something. Shank, anything could be a shank. Oh man, I wish I had a pen as a prop. Pens absolutely can be shanks. Pencils absolutely can be shanks. Rulers absolutely can be shanks. Because what they do is they will melt it and they will carve it down and it will get very sharp and pointy. And as long as it's sharp and pointy, you can stab somebody drawing blood. So it's dangerous. It is very dangerous. And these shanks that you see on the left are pieces of metal, probably a piece of metal that they swiped from maybe a carpentry class or a kitchen or anything, maybe even from somewhere in their room. But they will take it and file it down and mold it and carve it, and they will turn it into a dangerous, dangerous weapon. Sexual violence does exist in prisons as well. The individual that you see on your left, that is a man. He's not a woman. That is a man, but he does look and appear to be as a woman. One of the conversations that I had the last time I took students to a JOL a year ago was, what do you do with inmates who are trans, or you have inmates who are very mass presenting or femme presenting. So the most common response, and again, this is something that I would go over in greater detail in a corrections class. The common response is that if a person is transgender and they have had the surgery, quote unquote, below the belt, whatever they have below the belt is where they go. So if a person is very feminine looking, like you see the inmate to your left, nails, hair, eyebrows, very feminine appearing, but still has male bodily features below the belt, that individual is going into the male section of the prison, regardless. Can be a nightmare, can be very problematic for correctional officers, but there's nothing they can do because they have too much to worry about. However, if that person did go through the surgery and they have female organs below the belt, then they will go to the female side. So that's the easiest way to remember it. But why that's important is because of this 2003 important act, which is still operational today. And I'm surprised it took up until 2003 to get it, but it's called PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And that tries to address issues of sexual violence in jails and prisons. In other words, an individual who's in jail or in prison cannot consent to sexual relations with a staff member, and really they're not supposed to be able to consent with sexual relations between another inmate. Now, secrets out of the bag, typically jails and prisons won't enforce inmate on inmate mutual relations. However, if it's forced or it's against the other person's will, then yes, they will absolutely bring charges. But if the two people are having a consensual relationship and they're inmates, there's nothing they're going to do because there's bigger things to worry about. However, if it's a correctional officer and an inmate, I don't care if that correctional officer is 35 and the inmate is 35 too. Does not matter. Because of PREA, correctional officer will go to jail. And again, I love talking about this in corrections class because I have a lot of examples, especially right and around Atlanta, where this has been an issue. Medical care is a big issue too, primarily because prisons have to care for mental and physical health issues. They have to deal with older inmates. Prisoners over 55 are costing more and more to care for. Why? Because they're getting older. Right now, many of you that are listening to me are younger people. You're probably in your, late teens, maybe you're in 20, 21, but you're younger, right? Right now, you're probably not dealing with a whole lot of physical issues. But 20 years from now, when you start hitting your 40s, things start to change. When you're in your 50s and your 60s, things really change. So take care of your health while you're young, because when you get older, it's a lot more upkeep and it's costlier to deal with your health. And inmates who are older, they don't get a get out of jail free card because they're older. They still have to be taken care of with mental and physical health issues due to their age. And so, lastly, when looking at life after prison, we have to talk about parole. So, parole is a conditional release from prison. It's very similar to probation. The issue with parole is that if you violate the parole, you're going back to prison. If you violate the probation, you're going to jail, or you may not go to jail. You may be, released pending a court date, or there may not be a sufficient number of grounds or sufficient enough evidence to incarcerate. I remember violating a lot of people and I didn't have enough evidence to get a warrant. In fact, there were certain things that would have to happen for me to get a warrant. And even then, sometimes the judge won't sign the warrant. So I couldn't have them taken into custody or take them into custody just because. Whereas parole, you violate, you're going back to prison. They're going to lock you up right on the spot and take you right back to prison. And so for a person to get parole, they have to meet those conditions established by the parole board. The parole board sets these conditions and they ensure that these are the parameters that you will undertake in order to be released on parole. So when looking at community reentry, because now they're leaving prison and they're going back into the community, typically correctional facilities and prisons will have reentry programming. They will give them vocational training. In fact, one of the prisons I took students to in Atlanta a long time ago, this prison was revolutionary. They were doing some stuff that was just absolutely mind-blowing. They would actually, no returning citizen, as they called them, would leave the prison without a job. If they didn't have a job, then they were lined up to start work, but no returning citizen would ever leave the community without a job because they built strong partnerships with community stakeholders who would hire these individuals and employ them upon release from prison. They also might do community field trips, and I believe that prison did that, where they would do a field trip. They got permission, of course, from the state to take them on a field trip back to the community where they might be living, just to get them acclimated. Because for some of these people, listen, they may have been in prison for several years, 5 years, 10 years. Things change. You go to college, and you go to whatever college or university or wherever you're at, and you go away and you come back 6 months later, 5 months later, whatever, on a break, and you're like, whoa, what is all this new stuff? Could you imagine being gone for 5 years and come back? So for them, the newness is a shock. And that's why community reentry is so important, because if they don't have, our community field trips rather, is so important, because if they don't get acclimated to the community, when they are free and they don't have anybody holding their hand, so to speak, sometimes they can get overwhelmed, and that overwhelming feeling could lead to them to getting in trouble. In fact, being prisonized or dealing with prisonization, that can hinder reentry, because for some of them, they know the structure of getting up at 5 a.m, having breakfast at 6, having lunch at 11, having dinner at 4, and then going to bed lights out at 9. They know that structure. Now they don't have that, so they're going to be like, well, who's telling me what time to get up? You're telling yourself what time to get up. You don't have somebody that's going to pick up the phone and call you and tell you this is what you're supposed to do, because how you've been doing this for the last 5, 10, 15 years. Prisonization absolutely can hinder reentry. Employment. In terms of employment, obviously we know inmates sometimes have problems finding work due to their criminal history. If an inmate has extensive criminal history, and especially you're talking about someone that's been to prison, right? So they've done a felony. They could have done a serious felony or a less serious felony, but they've still committed a felony. Well, unfortunately, that is one of the biggest stigmas that affects them, having a felony and being in prison. But appearances matter too. So let me show you this. Would you hire this guy? Tattoos on his face? Ooh, 1488. I never noticed that the first time I showed this in my in-person class. 1488 are the 14 words of the Aryan Brotherhood. 88, the 8th letter of the alphabet, is H. 88 stands for HH, which is Hail Hitler. This is an Aryan Brotherhood. Are you going to hire this guy who's a member of the Aryan Brotherhood who can't stand people of color and minorities? That 1488, I've never noticed that until now. Literally, I'm like in real time with you guys. I never noticed that until now. This is an Aryan Brotherhood member, and I'm a member of the Gang Investigators Association, but I never picked up on that until just now. This individual right here, again, look at these tattoos on his face. You know, he's even got the lips tattooed. I mean, is that a person that you're comfortable with? If he's in the back cooking at, Outback or Texas Roadhouse or, Sonny's Barbecue, you probably don't mind, but it's probably going to make some women uneasy, and it might make some guys uneasy too, because this man has been to prison. And then this guy right here, same thing. Look at the swastika. Again, I didn't fully pick up on those the first time. He's got the Aryan kind of cross in there. The swastika is a strong indicator that he's Aryan Brotherhood. Once again, this is someone who is Aryan, or he's a skinhead, but either way, he's certainly Aryan. These are tattoos that would make me say, absolutely not. You're not going to get a job here in our establishment. And then this guy, and I picked him for last because he was my former probationer. His name is G.E. I won't give you his first name, but he's still in prison. Dangerous guy. At 14, 15 years old, he was committing very serious charges. I was his probation officer way back in the day with the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. And, he's robbed people. He's hurt a lot of people. He's dangerous. He's someone that I would tell probably all my my students to be like, hey, if you ever encounter this guy in Florida, go the other way, because he could hurt you very badly. He's very, very dangerous. And oh, by the way, all these tattoos he didn't have when he was on the outside. He got these tattoos in prison because they make their own tattoo guns in prison. And so lastly, to close this out, in terms of your relationship, whether you're married, whether you have a girlfriend, whether you have an established relationship, when it comes to convicts, for starters, they may not have many friends or family that they can rely on once they're released. Because think about it, you've been gone for a certain number of years and you need all the help you can get. Well, what if your family's like, I don't want to deal with you because you're a convicted felon, you've been to prison, there's a stigma associated with you being a prisoner, and heaven forbid you, let's say you committed a sexual offense. Not only are you a former convict and you're a felon, but you're also a sex offender, so there's a stigma there. Well, if you can maintain family ties, that can help, but it's challenging because a lot of family members don't want to talk to people who are incarcerated. So what are the factors crucial to a successful reentry? For starters, having housing, emotional support, acceptance, and encouragement, that's very crucial to successful reentry because, like I said, the prison in Atlanta, returning citizens are guaranteed housing when they go back into the community, and almost 90 to 95% are guaranteed employment. Others are in programs to get employment or they have employment pending. So that's success, right? That's a success that not many prisons can follow. But it took a lot of work to get that Atlanta prison to that point. Other prisons don't have that. If the person, the inmate or the parolee doesn't have acceptance, it doesn't have encouragement, it doesn't have strong emotional support, usually they're right back in prison within 30 days. Absolutely. 30 days is the max. If they make it past 30 days, they're not in the clear, but maybe they've established some form of bonding or some form of community where they can make it, they can sustain themselves. But if they don't have those things within 30 days, they will go back to prison. So I want to thank you for listening. We have officially closed out our third module, our third block, which focuses on the primary components of the criminal justice system. So we had law enforcement, 3 chapters. We had courts, 3 chapters. And now we have concluded with corrections, 3 chapters. So when we come back in our final week, I just can't believe that. Our final week, we have 2 chapters. We're going to focus on the juvenile justice system, and we're going to focus on some other contemporary issues within the criminal justice system, kind of like a sneak peek on what you can expect if you take some more specialized courses offered here. So I want to thank you for listening. Take care, be safe, and I'll see you next time.